Welcome to Big Hearted Indie, where we empower men in Indianapolis to forge deep connections through authentic friendships and service. Join us as we explore personal growth and community leadership and the transformative power of living out our faith in action. The podcast is produced by Citizen 7 and is hosted by Greg Enas, Don Palmer, and I am Chris Spangle. And today, our guests are Todd Fisher, who works with Justice Ventures International as a founding pastor at Trinity Church, and Glenn McDonald, a retired Presbyterian pastor and launched Zionsville Presbyterian Church. And Greg and Don are here. Greg, tell us a little bit about why we're having Todd and Glenn on today.
Well, our host here at Switchboard 801 said we were bringing the heavy hitters in today. And sure enough, it is a real privilege for Don and I to host dear, long-standing friends. And I know they're going to get into that because this podcast is about amplifying what friendships, in particular brotherly friendships, can mean over the long haul. And Glenn and Todd have been friends. They are the same age, I think, about the same age.
I'm going to catch up with Glenn one of these days.
Yeah. But we want to just emphasize their brotherly love for each other, for the Lord, and for the city. So we're going to have a great, engaging conversation, and we want to just highlight not only their friendship with Don and me, but how that friendship then has overflowed into love for the city and beyond that. So,
where did you and Don meet these fellows? How did you connect?
I'll let Don take that first, and then I'll close on that.
Well, I met, even though Glenn and I are Purdue Boilermakers.
Yes, sir.
I don't think we really knew each other at Purdue, but I used to attend Northminster Presbyterian Church 100 years ago. And
was Glenn your youth pastor?
No.
I thought you looked familiar.
He happens to be a contemporary. He earned his white hair just like I did. So that's where Glenn and I met. And then I knew his brothers, and we just... we were really co-laborers, and he was a kindred spirit in terms of some of the things I was doing around the city. And Todd, I have known, gosh, I don't know, since he was in junior high. His dad, Don, and I are business partners and extremely close friends. And so Fishers are like family to Palmers.
That's great. So how did you, Glenn and Todd, how did you two meet?
Glenn?
Dive in, Todd. I will just introduce that question by reporting what's unique in my life. Todd's the only person about whom I can say I have been his pastor, and Todd has been my pastor. We are, in fact, despite what Greg said a few moments ago, 18 years apart in age, and he grew up, at least in part. Part of Todd's faith journey was under my leadership at Zionsville Press. And later, post-ZPC for me, my wife and I ended up sitting in the pew where Todd was serving as the shepherd, for which we were immensely grateful.
It's all a very unlikely story, including that I was even attending church 30 years ago. So I grew up in the church and knew the Lord from a young age. And when I got to college, thought better of the faith that I'd been brought up in and was very much a prodigal. But I was invited to attend a church that my sister was actually on staff with.
She was.
And it would have been, I think, October of 1994. So that's 30 years ago. It was my senior year of college. And I, having been away from faith, was very much looking for something. And those truths that I'd been grounded in were starting to draw me back. And I remember sitting in the back row of Zionsville Presbyterian Church. And you might have noticed me because I think I was the only one with hair down to my shoulders. And I'm pretty sure I was wearing cutoffs. I don't know if that was the standard look at ZPC in the mid-'90s.
We had the ushers kind of keep you out of the line of sight of most of our worshipers.
Here's one of my favorite things about the story, though. So it was unlikely that I would even go to church. My sister invited me along. It was unlikely that I would come back, but there were two things that drew me back. One is that I was a film studies major, and you announced that the following Sunday, Michael Medved was going to be speaking. and I was very interested in what Michael Medved had to say.
He's a conservative political commentator, movie guy.
At the time, he was a movie critic.
Yeah.
Yep.
And while Michael Medved was of great interest to me, probably more of the draw was that just days after visiting your church, I received the most delicious apple pie. And there's apple pie, and then there's, what was the name of the place?
The Pie Safe.
The Pie Safe in Zionsville. And this was a substantial pie that largely kept this college student fed for the next several days. So I was reminded each day as I was having my big slice of apple pie about ZPC, and ended up coming back the next Sunday and just kept on coming.
I didn't actually remember where the story was going. I thought sure it had something to do with the feeding from the pulpit, but apparently it was the pie.
Well, actually, I was very much resonant with both what Glenn had to say and how he said it. And the Lord definitely used that to continue to draw me back.
So as you started re-exploring your faith, now it would be called deconstruction and reconstruction, right? Was Glenn instrumental in that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Tell us how.
Well, I would say that while we didn't have that language of deconstruction, that was something that had very much happened for me. And I would been looking through different things that I've been taught growing up and what it actually meant to me. Coming back and sitting under Glenn's teaching was so important to hear these truths spoken in a different way. And it was the Lord just used the way that he, week in, week out, shared the gospel in a very winsome way that was pivotal in my faith journey.
Do you remember, Todd, like from that time period, like did anything stand out other than, the cutoffs and long hair?
Todd's tremendous curiosity and desire to connect dots in his life, things that had been perhaps by Todd telling the story, things that hadn't fit together yet, and was wondering if there was a story or a narrative or a plot line that somehow connected us to Jesus and to each other. And just experiencing that as a friend was tremendous. I was truly moved, and I think that we began to grasp early on that we had some commonalities in our approach to life, our kind of borderline sense of humor. In the year 2006, my wife and I moved into a house in Zionsville that, strange as it sounds, was the house where Todd and his family had grown up.
Wow.
So I now look at my experience with Todd not only as having walked, as a friend with him, and both of us literally mentoring each other in a generational way, both back and forth, but I've lived in Todd's house, and there's a means by which that's kind of trivial, that I'm in the home that provided Todd and his family shelter. But I've also lived in Todd's house in some much more profound ways. We have lived in each other's tough moments, and we've lived in each other's moments where it's like, can it get any better than this? And I think that those shared ups and downs are really the essence of a focused friendship.
I want to capture a little bit of that in a bit more detail. How did you move from pastor, parishioner, family, and family into that friendship? You're starting to ramp up there, but we'd like to hear how friendships are forged and what was the magic that happened between you that enabled you to transcend age difference as well as pastor-parishioner differences to achieve a deep friendship.
So after attending the church for a couple of months, and maybe we would talk after services, and I'd come up, and those were in the days that you were wearing a robe. And I wish that we'd had some photos of me with my ridiculously long hair and very shaggy attire, and this guy in a robe. But after a few months of attending, he invited me to lunch. And I remember not quite knowing what to do with this. Like, I was wondering if I was in trouble. Was he going to ask me to go and visit another church, perhaps? Because, I was definitely bringing a different element.
I just wanted to see if your table manners were consistent with, what we expected.
So he invited me to lunch, and that's where it really all started. Because for me, as we sat and we shared the different aspects of our story, If you know anything about Glenn and his daily reflections, he's a well-read guy who thinks very deeply about things. And to get to hear not just a sermon, but some of the thinking that was behind the sermons was so helpful for me, especially at that particular age. And just some of the things that we started to share, in addition to our sense of humor, but things that we were both interested in. So Glenn, a lot of people don't know, is a pianist. Yeah. He's a man who loves music. And while he ended up, was your undergrad in chemistry?
Molecular biology.
Molecular biology. I didn't take either in college. So this guy, as a really deep thinker, is also a musician. And at the time, that was the main thing that I was focusing my energies on, in addition to trying to finish up my English degree with an emphasis in film studies. Was in a band, and our mutual appreciation of music and just thinking deeply and asking hard questions. Him asking me out to lunch, and then that became the next lunch. And many years later, we're still getting together for lunch.
Still doing it. Greg, your question maybe invites something that's more specific or technical than we can possibly answer. How did you become friends? And my answer is, I have no idea. And I'm going to quote C.S. Lewis on that, who said that in the whole realm of friendship, you come alongside somebody else and you suddenly realize, oh, you see things that way too. Mm-hmm. Or you laugh at that form of irony. Or you think it's kind of neat that somebody would say that about that author. Yeah. And all of a sudden you realize, this is my brother. And it just sort of sneaks up on you. And I think it's why some people that I thought might become good friends, we never quite connected. And someone like Todd, we almost, without examining what was going on, recognized we're going to do life together.
I love that. Yes. What? You too? You know, that's
yes. That's right.
That's so beautiful. Without missing that moment, we're going to go on that. But Todd, what was the name of your group, and where was your favorite practice and playing venue?
Well, I know where this is leading. I was at the time in a band that we'd taken our name from the sewer covers around Indianapolis, Neenah Foundry. Neenah, Wisconsin is a real place, and there is a foundry that's there. And we were doing well enough as a band that the actual Neenah Foundry found out about us and sent us a cease and desist. So we changed the spelling, and they left us alone. And one of the places that my band practiced was indeed in the barn that is next to Greg Enas' house today. So my uncle lived in that house and let us use the barn for practicing.
That's wild. Did you buy the house from his uncle, or is that just a coincidence too?
No, we bought it from someone who, his uncle sold it to Robbie Gordon, the race car driver.
Yeah, okay.
Robbie sold it to a guy at the track, and then we bought it from him.
So if you want to know what relational incest looks like, it's people who live in each other's houses and practice in each other's barns. And it's crazy.
Find out where you grew up and talk to those people in the house now. Don, do you have a question?
How is your approach to your pastoral duties similar and different?
That's a great question. I would say that we both foundationally think everything springs from understanding the word and being able to communicate it in a way that the message actually is heard. And people have a chance to go, I'm all in on that, or I need more information on that, or help me understand why this is, in your opinion, so critical. So both of us unite at the level of, man, how can we make the Sermon on the Mount come alive? How can we make the Jesus way of doing forgiveness, of doing confrontation, of doing friendship happen? And I would say that is the where the Venn diagram crosses. My hair has never been as long as Todd's, but
it's not that long anymore, Glenn. But it has
kind of long.
Terrible accident. But we preach the same way. We preach with a heart that's towards the person who's on the periphery and needs to know that it's safe to come another step.
Yeah, I would very much resonate with that, Don, that Glenn and I, as curious people, readers, those who are always asking questions, the thing that turned that into ministry was saying, how can we offer these things that we're learning the way that the Lord made our minds, not just to having information for ourselves, but being able to best communicate that to the people that the Lord has led us to. Yep. So in many ways, I think what Glenn is describing is he was preaching literally to the back row, to the person who might just be inching in, and that happened to be me. And therefore, as I ended up in ministry a couple of years after that, and I was in the training process to become a pastor, that Glenn's particular approach of thinking about that person who was maybe not yet convinced, in addition to speaking to those that maybe needed the particular things that they already believed confirmed. So I'm the beneficiary of that sort of ministry, and have tried to pass that along as well.
How has that back row vision animated the startups that you've launched?
In a startup, you don't have yesterday. All you have is tomorrow. And the blessing of that is you don't have somebody saying, we've never done Christmas this way, and you're messing it up. But you've got the opportunity to create a new way to help people hear and respond to the gospel. I would say that a startup is always thinking about its next 100 members, and what do they need? Now, eventually that becomes frustrating to the pioneers who go, wait a second, we put our stakes down here and we sweated and put in our equity and all that, which is absolutely true. But what I think brings about healthy church growth is always thinking about, well, who are the next 100 people who are not yet here? What will they need to know and to hear to come through that door?
One of the things that I've often thought about, especially in a city like Indianapolis, where we planted out of a great church, kind of in a different context. My first church plant was in the Broad Ripple area, and the church that we planted from was out in the suburbs. So there was some of that geographic reason for why we were planting in that particular place. But always on my mind was the person who was not yet in church. And because Indianapolis is a place that has always had great churches and different varieties, different approaches to ministry. But I've always been thinking about who are those people who are not in those existing churches. And the Lord seemed to bless that in ministries that I've been a part of, and definitely for Glenn as well.
We hear so much about the number of people that classify themselves as nuns, and church attendance after COVID seems like has dropped quite a bit. So what, you're both successful in attracting young people, both single and families. What was particularly effective? And as you look at reaching people in their 20s and 30s, early 40s now, what do you think is paramount to making the gospel relevant to their life?
Well, I think a clarification on the category none, the NONEs, those people appear to be, upon further examination, simply indicating that I do not have a specific affiliation at this time. So they're not, there's a lot of celebration among secular atheist communities, like, oh my gosh, look at that, we're quickly growing the number of people who've lost spiritual vitality. I would say it's people who are stepping back from what has been their experience so far of Christian community. And so they are not affiliated at this time. Now, that's not certainly all. There's been some secularism that has clearly made inroads in American culture. But what would be effective, I think, is to be willing to rethink what a healthy church looks like. That more than ever, we have to look at two ways that people are going to connect with each other and with the Lord. And that's going to be through smaller groups, small groups of conversation, action, and then one-on-one mentoring, one-on-one relationships, which I think hold the greatest opportunity for discipleship. So if I were in the pulpit today, I would be strongly emphasizing hospitality as a huge virtue. Invite your neighbors to have some fried chicken. Come on over. Let's eat fried chicken. Let's get back to pie. That seems to be where this conversation needs to keep going.
Chicken pot pie would bring
Chicken
both
pot.
of those
See, and that's the kind of creativity that will help the church. And then I would say, let's put our emphasis on those one-on-one connections as the means by which people can really unburden themselves of their doubts, their fears, their anger, the many, many people who are de-churched at this point, but who are open still to Jesus. They're not open necessarily to the church they grew up with, but they have not given up on Jesus.
Wow. Todd?
Yeah, very much along the lines of what Glenn said, that it has to be about relationships. And if you want to go back to the very beginning of the story in the book of Acts, it wasn't that there was a church service that they were putting on something that then people were attracted to a particular performance or a particular speaker or something like that. It was a group of relationships, and people saw from the outside what those relationships looked like, and they were drawn to it. And so while getting together on the Lord's Day to do what believers have done since the early days of the church, to be centered around the Word and to have the different practices of prayer and focusing that happen in traditional church gatherings, that's just the beginning of it. And I would actually say that no matter how contextually appropriate and high production a gathering might be, that's only going to keep people for so long if there's not an actual relationship. It's an awful lot of pressure on a speaker to have to hit it out of the park every single week if the whole thing that's keeping somebody at a particular church is going to be a speaker. And getting to your point, Don, post-COVID, if we want a good speaker, you can go online and find that person and just listen to them as you're driving around. There's something about an actual network of relationships in a church community that is the place that good teaching or even mediocre teaching can really come to life and help you to grow far beyond something that's just sort of a superficial, you're going in as a consumer.
There's a story from American history that I think adds an element to what you were just sharing, Todd. And let's go to 1945 when FDR suddenly disappears from the scene. We still have to finish out World War II. The bomb is still ahead, and here comes this vice president, Harry Truman, who comes into the Oval Office. He was not even told that there was a nuclear project underway, and he really was overwhelmed. His friend, Sam Rayburn, came. Sam was the Speaker of the House, and sat down with Harry and said, Harry, now that you're president, you're going to have all kinds of people come in here and tell you how great you are. And they're going to tell you what an amazing leader you are, and on and on and on. And then he leaned forward and said, but you and I both know you ain't. Now, the key to a transforming relationship is to have somebody lean forward and say, you may think you're hot stuff, and you may have heard this and this and this, but we both know, that's the key, we both know you ain't. And I think human hearts will always be searching for that kind of intimacy that no artificial intelligence is ever going to be able to discern, the way we can say, you're in pain, I'm in pain, you've got an affliction, I've got that affliction too, let's work on it.
That is so good. May I
go ahead.
Follow up on that? Glenn, you aren't sailing off into the sunset. You could if you wished, but you are treading and moving into choppy waters. Todd, you're moving into choppy waters. How is that friendship and that kind of accountability, vulnerability, and love going to look? What's it going to look like in the future as you both work together and work separately? both here locally and beyond. Tell us a little bit about that adventure that lies ahead.
I'll just start by saying I hope Todd and I get to do it together, that we'll keep having lunches, that we'll keep listening to each other's ministry opportunities. I definitely think there's no retirement from the Great Commission. There's no retirement from the opportunity to love God and love others. So there's great mystery, I think, on my part, because I'm so much older than you are, and on Medicare, I might add, you will love it.
I've heard about it.
You will love it. The fact is that not quite sure what the future will bring, except if it's been what the last 40 or 50 years have been. I'm quite eager to walk into that fog.
And give us just a little bit about what you are doing. And
we'll
Todd's
continue
part in
to do the morning reflections 5 days a week. I think at this point, what God's calling me into is a continuation of a series of focused spiritual friendships, and mentoring other pastors, mentoring others who are in various kinds of ministry.
That's beautiful. We can put a link to the morning reflections in the show notes.
Yeah, is it a blog? Is it an email newsletter? How's that? What's the form of that?
It is a post that comes out Monday through Friday each week. It was originally a workplace post presentation, and there's a website connected with it, but it's email platform delivered, and anybody can subscribe. There's no cost, and love to have kind of a digital fellowship with people.
Don?
So there's many. Greg and I have had the rug pulled out from underneath us career-wise in a few instances, a couple big. You two have had the rug pulled out of from underneath you.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
And there's a lot of folk on listening to this podcast that have had similar situations, whether it's in their families or in their vocations, etc. We think of pastors helping others. There's a lot of times where folk realize, hey, a pastor needs help. But how did you cope with that? And, men are not known for wanting to rely on others. Women seem to just do it naturally. Men like, hey, I'm toughing it up, I'm sucking it in, and I'm going it alone. So maybe some reflections on how you dealt with that, and whether there are any some habits, some practices, spiritual practices, some ways that you coped that made it so that you got through that choppy water on to the next chapter.
Well, I appreciate you mentioning that, Don, because I would say that some of the secret sauce of our relationship, in addition to intentionality of an older guy reaching out to a younger man. And that's something, if we've got some listeners that are in a particular place in life, actually, for goodness sake, if you're in your 20s, you could reach out to a high schooler. That there's something that somebody who is younger would benefit from the few steps that you have ahead of them. So there's definitely something about that. And then us realizing that we enjoyed being together, and that's something that's just you can't necessarily replicate that. Oftentimes it's just a work of the Lord. But I will say that one of the things that really bonded us together, as I look back at 30 years of friendship, and I didn't realize it was 30 years until this morning, that having gone through some difficulties and being willing to talk to each other about those difficulties, I would say that some of the setup for the difficulties was the intentionality of just getting together and talking about life, and maybe me coming to him with more basic, superficial questions that in many ways that was building the trust that was there, that when both of us have hit some difficulties vocationally and otherwise, that we knew that the other person was a safe person to go to. So for the sake of those who are listening, I would say that sometimes those people that you're pouring into, that you're spending time with, that you can't necessarily see the so what yet, oftentimes give it enough time and life happens, difficulties happen, and you're building a foundation that you can then, have something that we've been able to be there for each other in some pretty unusual vocational moments. So neither of us are currently pastoring. And some of what led to that in both of our lives, I think for you, is just that you were so old. But for me, honestly, it was a shock that I ever pastored at all. I had 20 years of leading local churches, and last year my wife and I discerned that as much as we enjoyed the ministry opportunities that we'd had, the door opened for me to work for this other mission partner. But as the things that were leading to some of these transitions were occurring, Glenn was somebody that I spoke to in real time, and I was very honored that as you've gone through some things, that I was somebody that you trusted to speak with as well.
That's true. I am part of a number of covenant groups, small groups of men who have decided to do life together. And one of the covenant groups I'm a part of has been meeting for almost 30 years. And I'm in it's a group of 50, but my group of 6, spread around the country. And when I was at a low point, I remember I was right where I was on 96th Street, driving, and my phone rang. And the guy who called me, I recognized his voice immediately. It was one of the pastors in my covenant group. He didn't even say hello. He just said, I understand there are some elders that I need to come up and kill.
This is being recorded, Glenn.
Yeah, and you have editing ability, right? I laughed so hard, and I had not laughed for several weeks. Mm-hmm. And at that moment, the gift that he gave to me was, hey, man, I'm in this with you. We're going to make it. And there's just nothing that is as much a treasure as that. By the way, I think that Todd was also one of those voices in my life, and I hope that I was a voice like that in your life as well.
Todd said there's a bunch of good churches in Indianapolis. Where is your vision to see Indianapolis heal and flourish? Where should we be pointing our energies, supporting you, being the Lord's hands and feet into our city as pastors, as brothers, as friends, as Hoosiers? What's your heartbeat there?
Well, one of the things that Glenn modeled for me early on was that those things that so oftentimes keep churches and maybe especially pastors away from each other are so oftentimes just not the heart of what it's all about. And so those theological specifics that as pastors we'll make jokes about, different, some of the nuances of what we believe are secondary things of theology, that those don't have to keep us separate. So while I was in a Presbyterian church and was in the ordination process, the first church that I planted was non-denominational. And for Glenn, there was no pressure, no disappointment that I didn't stay in his denomination, and very much stayed in contact with me, even though I wasn't, necessarily part of that fold anymore. Some of what I'd seen Glenn doing in his context of having a relationship with other pastors was really helpful for me early on in my ministry. And so from the get-go, this covenant group that you're talking about, I had a handful of other peer pastors. A number of us had been planting out of churches, largely in the suburbs, more into the city, that we started spending time together across denominational and theological, what historically would be divides. And so we had a really good vision, I would say, from Glenn and some of our older brothers who were getting pastors together. That was something that has been huge for me. So I've got a group of pastor friends that for the last 20 years, we've had relationships like this. I would say that for the future of the church, one of the things that continues to be really important for me, and even though I'm not pastoring a local church, this is one of the things that I'm still engaged in, is getting pastors and ministry leaders together across not just theological divides, but also across socioeconomic and racial divides. And that continues to be a project that some of those pastor friends and I are working on.
Lyle Schaller, by the way, thank you for what you just said. I think that is so spot on. And Lyle Schaller, the late, great church consultant, probably North America's premier analyst of the church in the second half of the 20th century, he said, church leaders cannot agree on anything. And he would go down the list of, nuances concerning the Trinity, how much water it takes to be properly baptized, how often the Lord's Supper should be administered, and whether the bread, there's tiny little tasteless, things that probably were served at your church, or something much heartier. Schaller said there's one exception: prayer. Prayer is the one thing that everybody agrees we simply have to be doing, and we can do that together. And it's interesting that red state, blue state people, I think we can dare to believe, can even be side by side and can come to God together saying, Lord, we need your help.
And if I might put in a plug for this group that is getting together, that's led by Dr. Clarence Moore from New Era Baptist Church. Some folks that are listening might be familiar with his ministry. And my slightly older brother in the faith, Jeff Krajewski from Common Ground. They have a long-standing mentoring relationship as well. And that relationship has led to an expanding group of pastors getting together with a vision for the city, and specifically, to Glenn's point, getting together and praying.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So you keep mentioning covenant groups, and I know we've talked about it with Greg and Don, but what is that, and how does somebody get into one if they want to have a covenant group?
Covenant group is an intentional gathering, usually of a group no larger than 10 or 11 or 12, that decides. I'll use the phrase we've used earlier today. We're going to do life together. We're going to be present with each other in terms of sharing our victories and our defeats, our hopes, our anxieties, and that group is going to have to meet. It's going to have to get together on some regular basis, and will have to, by God's grace, find its way to take off their masks. And, the first mask comes off, and that's a wonderful thing. And then you realize I've got 7 or 8 more masks on that are going to have to come off, and it's going to take many months and years for that to happen. But a covenant group is a group, in this case of men, who say, we are not satisfied with the level of openness, transparency, and authenticity in our relationships. I have to bare my soul to somebody. And can you be that person? Can I be that person for you? It's enormously risky and enormously exciting.
So you both have seen most of our audience are lay people. You've seen thousands of them. And Jesus said, I came that you might have life and have it more abundantly. What advice would you give to the audience to avoid burnout? Because pastors are notorious for burnout, but the kinds of jobs that people are in where feel like you're on 24/7. And what things would you recommend for just an extra dose of spiritual and life vitality?
Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. I think this is something that so many Americans, maybe especially men who are successful, and maybe guys like us who like to start things and take responsibility. If you've taken responsibility for something, there's never a day off. You've got to keep on going. You've got to keep it moving in order for it to sustain. But the gift of the Sabbath is the reminder that we are not God, and that anything that has happened is by sheer grace, and He's the one that ultimately holds things together. The Sabbath can look different ways for different people, but I know for me, one of the things that I was encouraged early on in Glenn in his teaching, before I was even remotely thinking about entering the ministry, was that you kept a Sabbath. And by a Sabbath, it's not that he stayed indoors and didn't cook, but there was one day a week that, barring something really extraordinary, that he was not going to be wearing that pastor hat and having that responsibility for the things that he was the other 6 days of the week. And that for me was very inspirational. And I continued to do that throughout my ministry. And it's made such a difference for me.
Man, you took the words out of my mouth. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who for many years was the chief rabbi of Britain, was asked this question, what is the most important commandment or key or linchpin to everything? And he goes, if you keep the Sabbath, you will keep all the other commandments. You will end up doing everything else eventually if you stop and let God be God. And that very important caveat, that means I am not God, which is an exceedingly challenging thing for Americans.
What do you do on your Sabbath? What does that day look like? Is it as little as possible? Is it?
When I look at my phone and see that it's Todd calling, I don't answer. Actually, my Sabbath, you mentioned, interestingly, cooking. For years, it was always the day in which I would cook something fun. I'm kind of the cook in our house, and it was a kitchen experiment day. I could read the book I want to read. I could play with my kids. I could be quiet. I could take a nap for sure, and just wear goofy clothes, and have the permission to say, you know what, I don't need to have that meeting today, or I don't want you to come over because you're going to, I want to be happy today, and you should stay out of my house, and as polite a way as possible, just create boundaries. And by the way, my congregation, it took a while for people to honor that because they wanted 24/7 access to their shepherd. And rather than realizing the shepherd is going to burn out, dry up, unless the shepherd has a chance, just like everybody else. This is not just a pastoral thing. This is for all of us.
Greg, go ahead, Todd.
Well,
Because I just don't think a lot of guys can imagine that.
Yeah, for me, the Sabbath was a day that I didn't do the things that I did the rest of the time, which left a whole bunch of things to do. So, maybe some people's conception of the Sabbath is a day of resting as far as not doing anything, or maybe not doing any physical labor. But as a pastor, I was with people all the time. I'm an outgoing person. I love being with people all the time. But it was a day that I didn't take meetings. If I was going to be with anybody, it was just going to be the closest of friends, and maybe even them on that day. I would just take some time and be alone and be quiet. And for me, doing physical labor. So that was the time that I would work around the house. I would work on the lawn. When I met Glenn, I was a landscaper, and so it would be on that. I would take Fridays as my Sabbath on Fridays. That's when I would do my gardening, which, while it was necessary physical work, it was also just really good. It was good to get out and do something that I wasn't able to do too often the rest of
and
of
that
my
is
week.
that is really key. It's both things. It's things I don't do and things I choose to do. And many of those things I choose to do, I literally am too busy to try to ever squeeze in the rest of the week. So therefore, the Sabbath becomes this exciting thing of, I can't wait just to be able to go out and do a jigsaw puzzle, if that settles my spirit.
Along this journey, your families have been with you. Tell us a bit more about your families, specifics, your engagement as leaders in the past and also in the present, and what lessons possibly might help some of our guys. Everyone has a family. Some are actually raising kids or have grandkids and loving their spouses. Give us a little bit of flavor there.
Go right ahead.
So I have been married to Angeline for coming up on 26 years. And we have 3 kids, 2 daughters about to graduate from Indiana's finest educational institution, Indiana University. We have a football team now.
Oh my!
Don't
And
rub it in, Don.
I have a 15-year-old son who is at North Central High School. I think a key thing that I'd love to say to folks who are listening is that your wife is your partner. And the word in Genesis 2 for the role that the woman played to the man of helpmate does not mean personal assistant, doesn't mean intern. It's the same word that is used for how God comes alongside humans in our weakness. So to recognize the strength of the partner that the Lord has given to you, and that's very much the case for my wife. While I've had this ministry that when she met me, I was working at the church that her family attended, and she knew that she was going to be along the ride as the wife of somebody who was in full-time ministry. But she has her own ministry, and she's had her own ministry throughout our marriage. She is an attorney who has only ever worked in one particular legal setting. She's been at the Neighborhood Christian Legal Clinic here in Indianapolis for about 23 years, so since she graduated from law school. And she does refugee asylum work. And in many ways, her ministry is the thing that I am most excited about and want to support, and that I've been able to say, you are not just here to give me support and color commentary, but you have your own gift set, and whatever we can do to encourage each other mutually in our ministries has been really key for us.
That's beautiful.
My wife's name is Mary Sue, and Mary Sue and I will be celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary next summer. We found out, by the way, that after about the 40th, you have to make up your own, like what that is, and we decided that 49 was Taco Bell. Anything you want in the drive-thru, honey, anything. We have 4 kids, 3 boys and a girl. They're all married. They all live within 20 minutes of our house. So our 9 grandchildren are all easily accessible, and that's pretty cool. Dr. John Gottman is well known as a marriage researcher in North America, and I years ago read something that I found kind of hard to accept. Gottman said that approximately 70% of the things that spouses disagree on can never be resolved. 70%. Now, what falls in the 30%? 30% would be what's for dinner, and the water pump went out in the car. How are we going to get to work tomorrow? Okay, you can figure those things out. But the 70% include things like, what's the definition of a clean house? I've been very fortunate to have God's definition of a clean house be mine, whereas Mary Sue has struggled to come alongside me in that. And this is not really accessible to
Do you want that edited
wives.
out?
They don't really watch this, do they?
Okay.
What would be a romantic evening? Wow, spouses have incredibly different ideas. What is a retirement that would be ideal for you as a couple? And you find out that this person that you married and have fallen deeply in love with over decades, that we're still working on these things in which we never have come to some mutuality or consensus. So what Gottman recommends is take turns, laugh, enjoy the quirkiness of the fact that God thought this was a good idea. And basically we are living Mary Sue's retirement. We're living her dream, which is we live on a little horse farm. And this was not what I ever thought I was going to be doing. As a kid, I was taunted, old McDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O. It's all come true. I'm old, I live on a farm, and my name is McDonald. And yet the depth of the joy that we have now together, going out and working with animals, being outdoors every single day in all the weather, that has probably been the most romantic thing that has happened in our half century.
That's great. All right. Well, final thoughts. I mean, in terms of friendship, like give guys some advice. You've probably had men's ministries and seen a lot of these friendships form. Like what are some things, since you're pastors, what are some actionable steps that our listeners can take to build more friendships with men in their life?
Take a risk. Take a risk and tell the truth. Tell the truth about yourself. Vulnerability creates opportunity for vulnerability. And until one of us is willing to lower the mask a little bit and say, you know what, I'm not really that happy, or I'm desperately afraid of fill in the blank, take a risk.
I would say similarly that there is likely already a relationship if somebody's listening and they neither have a mentor nor somebody that they're pouring into, that there's somebody that is in your life already. It's not like you have to go out or find a friend online or something like that. There's already a connection that's there, and there's a good chance that that person would be so appreciative of just being reached out to. And I think that's where the first risk begins, of just reaching out and not saying, hey, can I become your mentor, or would you mentor me? But getting together with somebody, and then after a good time of connection, follow it up. Get to say, let's do this again next month. And the reaching out in the first place, but also an intentionality of continuing to spend time getting to know each other. And it's as you do spend time that so oftentimes the context is built that you can start to be more vulnerable.
Greg, any final thoughts?
Thank you. This has been a real blessing. I love you guys. Don and I love you, and appreciate you sharing with us this morning. And I know that I'm looking forward to many, many more years with you here in Indianapolis.
Your friendship, both of you, means the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that for me, as I think about longstanding friendships and what can grow beyond just a personal benefit, is very much what I see in your lives. Our whole city is blessed by your friendship. So
absolutely.
I look forward to continuing to watch you guys and to reading the book when you actually capture all the secrets to what happens here.
All right. Thanks so much for listening to Big Hearted Indy. Thank you so much to our guests, to Don and Greg, and you for listening. And if you got something out of this, please share it with your friends and your network. We appreciate it, and we'll see you again next month.